leaders. Look at what the United States and Israel do at the beginning of the Iran war. They take out all of Iran's senior leaders. There's at least two problems here. First of all, you don't know who's going to replace them. And of course, we're now having trouble with a more hardline faction in Iran. It also erodes any possibility of trust. I mean, how can you sit down and negotiate a peace agreement with a regime that has killed your senior leaders and might do something again subsequently? And then finally, as that norm begins to erode, others are going to use it too. Others will start using similar tactics, and leaders, including American presidents, are going to have to worry much more about this than they did necessarily in the past. All right, you put all of those things together, continued great power competition, eroding norms against the use of violence in a variety of different ways. I think you end up with a much more dangerous world. And I think, unfortunately, the world agrees with that, because if you look at the last 20 years or so.
大家好，这里是华人视角频道。刚才的精彩集锦已经把一个残酷现实摆在我们面前：当暗杀高层、推翻政权逐渐被包装成解决问题的捷径，世界的安全底线也会随之不断下坠。表面上，这似乎是在用强硬手段换取和平，但实际上，你消灭的可能不只是一个领导人，还可能摧毁谈判所需要的信任，催生更强硬的接班力量，并让其他国家照着同样的逻辑行事。更值得警惕的是，战争结束并不代表危险结束。美俄关系的猜疑、大国竞争的升级、经济相互依赖被武器化，以及美国在中东长期反复介入，都在把世界推向更加脆弱的平衡。接下来这场访谈将从伊朗战争谈到俄乌冲突，再谈到中国崛起、亚洲势力范围、美国的全球战略以及核扩散和民主制度正在面临的深层危机。两位嘉宾不会只讨论谁赢谁输，而是追问这些战争究竟为何发生，错误为什么一再重演，决策者又该如何为后果负责。真正危险的或许不是某一场战争，而是整个世界正在逐渐习惯战争。
First of all, thanks so much for doing this.
Nice to be here.
So let's start at the end, the anticipated end. When and if the United States resolves its role in these two wars against Russia and against Iran, what does the world look like, do you think?
I think it looks like a substantially more dangerous world, actually, than we've seen for, say, most of my...
After the wars.
Yeah, after the wars. Well, it's going to leave the world in a I think, a more precarious condition, and for sort of larger, more enduring reasons than just these conflicts. I mean, the relationship with Russia is not going to improve for a while, even if the war formally comes to an end. There's lots of suspiciousness on both sides now, so that's going to be a problem. China is going to continue to improve its military power. It's going to continue to grow economically. It's going to continue to challenge the United States and others for influence around the world. So that's going to be a source of tension. We have, I think, in the world today, you're seeing other powers, lesser powers being more active and not always constructively. Think of the role that the UAE has played in the civil war in Sudan. So they're involved in fueling conflicts in a variety of other places. So you're going to see a tripolar world, Russia, China, the United States as the three main powers, with some unresolved tensions among them, continued, I think, concerns about what's going on in Asia and what China's ambitions might be there. And in a situation where no one really trusts America's judgment anymore. And that's, I think, an artifact of the war, especially the war in Iran. Let me point to one other thing that I think people sometimes forget about, and that's what we've seen, I think, a pretty dramatic erosion in the normative environment surrounding the use of force. And I'm a good realist, so I don't think norms in international law are everything, but they're not irrelevant. So one of the things we've seen is essentially a collapse of the norm against assassination. For a long time in world history, governments didn't try to assassinate each other. Leaders of other countries didn't try and kill each other in conflicts. This was a common practice 500 years ago, and it gradually fell from favor, and a norm emerged against it. And you can understand why. It was in everybody's self-interest, if you were a king, if you were a prime minister, not to be trying to kill each other. Moreover, great powers liked this norm because it meant that conflicts would be decided on the battlefield where they had all the soldiers and all the wealth and could win. Assassination is a tool of weaker powers.
Right. It's asymmetrical, of course.
Right. And beginning at the end of World War II, when the Allies began to hold leaders accountable, Nuremberg trials, the Tokyo War Crimes trials, this idea that what you did as a statesman was sort of separate began to erode. Once that began to erode, then going after a leader, going after Muammar Gaddafi, going after Saddam Hussein, begins to look morally preferable. Why not just take out this troublesome leader as opposed to
spare the population?
Yeah, spare the population. You could make this argument. Of course, this is a very dangerous road to go down because now it's becoming a much more common practice. Look at what the United States and Israel do at the beginning of the Iran war. They take out all of Iran's senior leaders. There's at least two problems here. First of all, you don't know who's going to replace them. And of course, we're now having trouble with a more hardline faction in Iran. It also erodes any possibility of trust. I mean, how can you sit down and negotiate a peace agreement with a regime that has killed your senior leaders and might do something again subsequently? And then finally, as that norm begins to erode, others are going to use it too. Others will start using similar tactics, and leaders, including American presidents, are going to have to worry much more about this than they did necessarily in the past. All right, you put all of those things together, continued great power competition, eroding norms against the use of violence in a variety of different ways. And I think you end up with a much more dangerous world. And I think, unfortunately, the world agrees with that, because if you look at the last 20 years or so, in constant dollars, defense expenditures have basically doubled in the world over the last 20 years because...
Not just in the U.S.
Not just in the United States. You see this happening in Asia. You see this happening in Europe now. Belatedly, but finally happening. And I think that's all evidence that around the world, people anticipate a much less secure environment than the one we've had.
Not what we were promised. We were promised by certain factions in American politics peace based on global trade. Globalizing the economy was supposed to guarantee stability because you don't go to war with your trading partners. That's what they told us.
Right. And I should have mentioned that. I mean, the other thing that's happening is we're seeing the onset of not an end to global trade, not even a complete end to globalization, but certainly a retreat back from it. Raising of trade barriers, increased protectionism, particularly in high technology, things like that. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. You're going to see a much more competitive economic environment and what has been called weaponized interdependence, people trying to gain political advantage by using others' vulnerabilities or others' dependence, the way the United States has weaponized the role of the dollar in the international financial system, imposing sanctions, the way Iran has weaponized everyone's dependence on the Strait of Hormuz to advance political agendas. So all of that's going to contribute.
But can we put those cliches to bed that, democracies don't go to war against their neighbors, that trading partners don't have wars? Like, that's just none of that's true.
Well, you want to be careful here. There is some evidence that democracies are less likely to fight each other. It's soft evidence. I wouldn't want to base my entire foreign policy around that assumption. But you don't want to completely throw it out. And secondly, again, big macro studies will show you that, in fact, high levels of economic interdependence do make international conflict between the partners less likely. That is to say, there's a statistical relationship there. It is not, however, an absolute guarantee. The fact that you have an extensive economic relationship with someone doesn't mean you won't fight them. It just makes it somewhat less likely. Also, you can make the reverse argument arguably even more powerfully. It's not so much that interdependence causes peace. It's rather that peace causes interdependence.
Yes, exactly.
When you have a stable political environment.
Thank you for saying that.
No, when you have a stable political environment, people don't think war is very likely.
That's right.
Then they're willing to trade with someone else much more readily. They're willing to invest in a foreign economy without worrying that somehow that's going to get nationalized or seized. because a conflict emerges. And once people begin to see that conflict is likely, and I'm talking to investors here, they quite naturally begin to pull back. And governments encourage them to pull back because they're worried about what the balance of power is going to be, et cetera. So the optimism of the, say, early 1990s that we were going to head into this wonderful, Fukuyama and Friedman-esque world of globalization and peace and harmony, there was a grain of truth in that. If the world had remained peaceful and tranquil, then interdependence looks more attractive. But once the world starts to look more dangerous, people begin to worry more about security than they do about wealth.
Why have American policymakers been unwilling to be realistic about the rise of China? It seems like everything in the last 20 years, the subtext of a lot of it is like a total unwillingness to deal with the fact that we're not in charge of everything because China has this enormous economy.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of factors that went into this. I mean, first, there was a certain degree of just general American hubris, particularly post-Cold War. We've won the Cold War. We have the magic formula. We have the model for how you organize a modern society. It's got to be a market-based economy. It's got to be based on rule of law. It's got to be open to trading with others. That's the modern world. And this is what you get when you read, Frank Fukuyama, who is, in my view, a fine scholar, but was wrong about that, and some others in the 1990s. That's what we generally believed, and it was bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats largely all subscribed to this idea. And a key part of that was because we had found the magic formula. This was the answer. China had finally embraced markets and would inevitably become democratic because its citizens would get wealthier. There would be a middle class. That middle class would want freedom and political rights, and it would insist upon being able to express itself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you could tell yourself a pretty good story for how this is all going to work out. And then once China's a liberal democracy and all engaged with everyone and a member of all these international institutions like the World Trade Organization, we're going to have not a perfect world, but the best world we've ever had. Again, nice story, and there was a coherent logic to it. It turned out to be wrong. The Chinese Communist Party was not about to liberalize. They put a premium on political control and had lots of ways of doing it. And we were too eager and too hasty to bring them into all of these institutions, to engage them.
当一场战争终于停火，真正的问题往往才刚刚开始。停火不等于和解，协议也不等于信任。通过这场访谈，我们看到的并不是某一场冲突的孤立结局，而是一个正在发生深刻变化的世界。大国之间的竞争更加激烈，地区强权更加主动，经济联系开始被当成施压工具。而原本约束国家行为的规则，也在一次次军事行动和政治算计中被削弱。被访谈最重要的提醒是，战争结束之后，世界未必会变得更安全。美国与俄罗斯之间的猜疑不会因为战场暂时安静而消失，中国的经济和军事力量仍在增长，亚洲的战略竞争还会持续，欧洲也在重新思考自身的安全边界。过去那个由单一强权主导、依靠全球贸易维持稳定的时代，正在逐渐退潮。未来的世界更可能是多个力量中心彼此牵制，却又缺乏足够信任的三级格局。在这样的格局中，最危险的变化之一是使用暴力的门槛正在下降。过去各国即使敌对，也会尽量避免直接刺杀对方领导人，因为所有政府都明白，一旦这种规则被打破，任何人都可能成为下一个目标。但今天清除对方高层、推翻政权，甚至把斩首行动包装成拯救平民的手段，正在变得越来越容易被公众接受。问题在于，杀掉一个领导人并不等于解决了一个国家的问题，你无法确定继任者会是谁，也无法保证新政府更加温和。相反，暴力往往会让强硬派获得更大支持，让普通民众失去对谈判的信心，更让未来的和平协议失去可信度。当一个国家相信对手随时可能再次撕毁承诺，所谓外交就很容易沦为战争间隙中的短暂停顿。这也是伊朗问题最难解决的地方。对美国而言，这是一场可以选择不打的战争，但对伊朗政权而言，却可能被视为关乎生死存亡的战争。双方在意的程度不同，能够承受的代价不同，最后做出的选择自然也会不同。一个强大的国家未必能够轻易迫使一个弱小但高度恐惧， 并且愿意承受巨大损失的对手投降。军事优势可以摧毁设施，却很难摧毁一个政权的求生意志。俄乌冲突也说明了同样的道理。战争一旦陷入双输僵局，双方都会相信，只要再坚持一段时间，就能耗垮对手。可是战场上的每一点推进都可能伴随着巨大的人员和资源代价。真正现实的和平往往不是让某一方彻底满意，而是在双方都承受痛苦的时候找到一个能够维持的妥协。问题是，妥协需要耐心、专业的团队和清晰的安全安排，更需要政治人物承认某些目标在现实中根本无法实现。访谈也拆穿了一个长期流行的幻想，那就是民主国家不会彼此开战，贸易伙伴也绝不会走向战争。民主和贸易确实可能降低冲突概率，却从来不是绝对保险。更准确地说，稳定的政治环境会促进投资和贸易，而不是贸易自动创造稳定。一旦各国开始担心战争，资本就会撤退，供应链就会调整，政府也会把相互依赖转化成制裁、禁运和技术封锁的工具。未来的全球化不会彻底消失，但它会更加区域化，更强调所谓友岸合作，经济安全也会压过单纯的效率和低成本。关于中国崛起，访谈给出的反思同样值得重视。冷战结束后，美国曾经相信市场开放会自动带来政治自由，相互依赖会最终消除战略竞争。这套逻辑并非完全没有道理，却把一种可能性误当成了必然结果。中国在融入全球经济之后壮大起来，但并没有按照美国预想的方式改变。美国企业从中获得了廉价商品和巨额利润，却也低估了经济力量重新分配之后对国际权力格局带来的长期影响。因此，面对中国，美国真正需要的不是自欺欺人的单极幻觉，也不是情绪化的全面对抗，而是承认现实，重新思考亚洲的力量平衡。中国希望减少美国在亚洲的影响，美国当然也不会愿意看到中国主导整个亚洲。关键不在于哪一方拥有绝对控制权，而在于各方能否建立一套既不牺牲安全，又不断制造危机的相处方式。中东问题则揭示了另一个教训。撤军不等于放弃一切，介入也不等于长期占领。一个国家可以在必要时维护地区力量平衡，却没有必要长期驻军操纵地方政治，更不能把推翻政权当成解决一切问题的万能钥匙。美国过去在中东不断扩大军事存在，很多时候正是因为太过自信，认为自己能够按照计划重塑整个地区，结果却让自己陷入更深的冲突泥潭。当然，减少军事存在也有风险，包括核扩散、地区军备竞赛和新的权力真空。但真正成熟的政策不是拒绝考虑风险，而是比较不同选择的代价。继续深度介入可能制造新的敌人，仓促撤离也可能留下危险空白。最合理的做法应该是谨慎选择介入时机和介入目的，在维护基本安全的同时，避免把每一次地区危机都变成一场长期战争。访谈最后把问题带回到民主本身。为什么民众一次次希望政府少管海外，多关注国内，最终却总是看到新的战争和更庞大的军费？为什么公众反对无休止战争，政治人物却仍然能够在利益集团、军工体系和媒体环境的推动下重复旧路？这说明民主不仅是投票，更是要让公共政策真正接受持续监督，让决策者为失败负责，让民众能够清楚知道国家究竟为一项政策付出了什么代价。一个健康的制度不应该因为一个人犯过一次错误，就永远剥夺他服务公共事务的机会，但也不能让那些反复犯错、从不认错、从不学习的人一次又一次回到原来的位置。真正值得尊重的不是永远声称自己正确的人，而是能够说明自己错在哪里，哪些判断被误导，下一次准备如何避免重蹈覆辙的人。问责不是为了制造恐惧，而是为了让权力知道错误不能被包装成胜利，失败也不能被遗忘。更值得警惕的是，在社交媒体主导的舆论环境里，人们有时会因为一句话、一个立场，甚至一件与政策无关的小事而遭到围攻。结果是真正需要被讨论的决策责任被掩盖了，敢于提出异议的人反而付出代价，而那些制造灾难的人却能够换一个职位，换一家智库，换一种说法重新出现。没有公开讨论，就没有真正的纠错，没有对意义的保护，就没有可靠的决策。从法国大革命的历史到现代福利国家的建立，访谈还提出了一个不能回避的警告：当财富高度集中，普通人缺乏经济安全和政治参与感， 国家又因为对外战争而债务沉重，同时信息传播速度远远超过制度消化能力，社会就可能进入一种不稳定状态。历史不会简单重复，但相似的结构性压力往往会催生相似的危险。真正能够保护一个制度的，不是少数人的财富和权利，而是让更多人感到自己仍然属于这个社会，也能够通过合法方式改变自己的命运。所以本期内容最终留下的启示，并不是简单的支持哪一方，也不是用一句口号解释所有战争，而是要求我们重新学习判断。面对国际冲突，要区分安全威胁与政治野心，区分必要防卫与主动扩张，区分暂时胜利与长期结果。面对政府的承诺，要追问目标是否现实，代价由谁承担，失败之后谁负责。面对媒体和舆论，要警惕那些最响亮、最简单、最能激发愤怒的答案。因为真正重要的问题往往复杂、缓慢，而且没有立刻让人痛快的结论。世界不会因为我们拒绝思考而变得简单，也不会因为我们把失败改成胜利就真的获得安全。和平需要实力，但更需要可信的承诺；民主需要选票，但更需要问责和诚实；国家需要国防，但更需要知道何时克制，何时止损。一个能够承认错误并及时改正的国家，未必显得软弱，反而可能重新获得信任。真正危险的从来不是承认一次失败，而是明明已经看见失败，却仍然因为面子、利益和权力继续把所有人拖向更大的代价。以上就是本期内容的总结。你认为面对越来越复杂的国际局势，一个国家最应该优先守住的是军事优势、经济利益，还是外交信誉？也欢迎把你的看法留在评论区，和更多观众一起讨论。别忘了点赞订阅，继续收看更多精彩视频。